From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. As hymns go, it's an interesting choice. But on this Friday in November, in a little church in Idaho, the congregation has gathered for the daily service and they're belting out. The Son of God goes forth to war, a kingly crown to gain. His blood-red banner streams afar, who follows in his train? It's a more intriguing choice when you realise the pastor of this church has very forthright opinions on war and geopolitics.
Iran really is a wicked, wicked place. If we're in a war with them at all, it is appropriate to fight aggressively and to speak of it in that way.
And that's not the only thing he has strong views on.
What has feminism done besides destroy everything?
You can't be pro-choice and a Christian.
You can be pro-choice and a Christian, but not a good one.
Can you be gay and a Christian?
Not a good one. Women are created by God to be helpers to their husbands. I'm fond of saying that if you're a Christian pastor and you're not routinely accused of being a patriarchalist, a misogynist, a white supremacist, you're not doing your job.
And this pastor, who seems to enjoy courting controversy, isn't a fringe voice in a small American city. His church is growing in influence across America, and he has powerful friends and followers in the Trump administration.
Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, worships as part of our church service in Washington, D.C. How does that factor into all of this?
It's a good question. Just how much influence does this pastor have over the Secretary of War? Are his views shaping policy in the Pentagon? And what are his plans to expand the church in the UK? The story today. Who is Doug Wilson, pastor to the US Secretary of War?
Because of the election of Donald Trump and because of his promotion of evangelical Christians, for example, Pete Hegseth as the defense secretary, into prominent positions, Doug Wilson's influence has grown significantly. And indeed, you can see the evidence of his influence in the way that the Trump administration has talked about the war in Iran.
That's George Grylls, Washington correspondent for The Times, who recently interviewed Pastor Doug Wilson to understand his views and his newfound power in Washington.
So just a week before the US started its war, he was invited to the Pentagon to lead prayers alongside Pete Hegseth. He was basically the guest of Hegseth. Now, you might have seen those kind of clips of the war secretary, who has kind of been talking about how he wants to break the teeth of the ungodly, and how he wants every round to find its mark.
Behold now the wicked who rise against your justice and the peace of the righteous. Snap the rod of the oppressor, frustrate the wicked plans, and break the teeth of the ungodly.
He's used prayers that are kind of relying on this Old Testament rhetoric that's really quite violent to kind of talk about the Iran war. And you have to trace that back to the influence of Wilson, who is the head of his church. He's a 72-year-old preacher. He's based in Moscow, Idaho, which is a town a long, long way from Washington. And yet he is now opening a church in Washington itself because of the growth of his movement and because of the success that he's having in kind of converting members of the Republican Party and people on the right of American politics to his form of Christian nationalism.
When it comes to Doug Wilson, you mentioned small town Idaho, where he's been based. That's where you went to meet him. So just describe the scene for us. What was it like?
So Moscow, Idaho is right on the border between Washington State, which is in the Pacific Northwest, but it's several hundred miles into the interior, and it's on the border of Washington State and Idaho. It's basically an agricultural region. It's one of the most productive agricultural parts of the US. There are these kind of rolling fields, particularly wheat, but also rapeseed. And then, if you go a little bit further inland, you're starting to hit some pretty serious mountains. And, we were there in spring and still the mountaintops of kind of snow. But the town of Moscow itself, you wouldn't arrive and think automatically, well, of course, there's going to be a Christian nationalist church here, that there's going to be a lot of religious extremists that live in this part of the US, because it looks like a liberal town. There are kind of pride flags hanging everywhere. There are coffee shops that have kind of matcha brewed drinks and all the rest of it. So it looks like you could be in, I don't know, Hackney or Brighton or somewhere. And this is a very deliberate choice, because Doug Wilson chose to, well, in fact, it was his father, Jim Wilson, who was also an evangelical Christian, who decided that he was going to situate his church in Moscow because it has a population of students. And in a kind of almost antagonistic way, Doug Wilson and his father put their church specifically there in order to try and win over students, convert them, in the hope that then they would spread out across the rest of America and kind of win more of the American population for God.
And tell us about the man himself. This is Pete Hegseth's pastor. What was he like when you met him?
I mean, the man himself, he has this kind of Old Testament beard. He seems very affable.
I love the UK, been there a number of times. I like being in foreign countries, but it's a real plus when you don't have to learn the language.
He is obviously intelligent and well-read. Christopher Hitchens, I'm right in thinking, was a kind of friend and a
yes,
sparring partner.
Sparring partner here, but I'm friends with Peter Hitchens, his brother. Seen him different times over in the UK, in Oxford.
He very much appreciates the kind of British culture, but you would have to say his kind of, he doesn't like modern culture, put it that way. I tested whether or not he would like someone like Matisse, and that was considered too modern a cultural taste for him.
Tell us a bit about how Doug Wilson becomes Doug Wilson. So before we get on to his influence now, what do we know about his early life?
I think it's important to see religion as being bound up with the US military, even at this stage. So his father served in the Navy and was an evangelical Christian. And in what I was just mentioning, his decision to kind of situate the church in a kind of small university town, that was no accident. He actually wrote a book where he applied the lessons of warfare, so Clausewitz and Sun Tzu and all these kind of famous military theorists, to converting people to evangelical Christianity. So, thinking about a spiritual warfare, thinking about it as a campaign where you need to take over the world, that is their kind of approach to thinking about religion. And Doug Wilson himself was born in San Diego, which is obviously a kind of home to a big US naval presence. He actually grew up in Japan, where his dad was stationed. His mum was a missionary over there, Christian missionary. So it's really this kind of fusing of a military upbringing and a deeply evangelical Christian one.
That's fascinating. So this is the sort of worldview where liberalism is seen as an insurgency. How did he himself come to religion? Is it through the mother who's a missionary?
And his father as well. I mean, both of them were evangelical Christians, and that was their job, essentially, to spread the word of God. And following the election of Donald Trump, he has gained a foothold. They now have, I think, 45,000 members of his church, which is called the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. And that spread across 170 churches, one of the most recent of which is now in Washington, D.C. itself. So from this small, isolated place in Idaho, he's kind of spread his influence pretty far and wide.
This is now a religious movement. How did he come to found the church? What was he trying to do with that? How did it feel different to other forms of evangelical Christianity?
The original church in Moscow is called Christkirk, and it wasn't until the 1990s that he founded the wider movement, CREC, on the basis of a mixture of kind of religious schooling. He wanted to open schools with an explicitly kind of Christian curriculum. I mean, for example, he believes the world is 6,000 years old, that it started with Adam and Eve. He thinks that evolution doesn't exist. I mean, he talked to me about how they teach The Origin of Species and Charles Darwin, and he was kind of quite proud of the fact that all his students had read it compared to students maybe in public high schools across the US who haven't. But of course, they're teaching it from a critical perspective. They're saying this is all baloney, and that, of course, humans aren't descended from apes.
Tell us a bit more about what they do and don't believe in.
It's a very kind of hierarchical idea of society, but at the core of it is the family unit. And of course, they think that homosexuality is a sin.
Bad one.
Bad one.
Yeah.
But this Trump administration has quite a few homosexual members of the cabinet.
That's not like the Treasury Secretary.
Yeah.
Even though Wilson is a firm Republican supporter, he opposed the fact that Scott Bessent, who is the Treasury Secretary, was appointed to Trump's cabinet because he is gay. And not only that, they also believe men should play the role of head of the household, and the entire household should vote as a bloc.
I would be happy 250 years from now if the civil elections were the same way that we do it in the church, which is one vote per household.
And that means that in the vast majority of cases that women are basically disenfranchised.
Your wife, for example, is
My wife
allowed to
votes.
vote.
My wife votes. My daughters vote. My daughter-in-law votes. My granddaughters, who are old enough, vote.
But they all vote. Once you've had a discussion, you say, we're going this way.
Oh, we never have to have a discussion.
Right.
We're all of one mind. We're all of one mind.
He gave a few exceptions, like if a woman lost her husband and was a widow and had children, she would be allowed to vote as the head of that household. But in the vast majority of cases, it's basically only men who are allowed to vote.
And for the women in this equation, I mean, it does sound very sexist. What is the role of women in this church? How are they viewed?
The role of a woman is to produce babies, basically. You look at some of the language that Doug Wilson has used in previous essays. He is pretty concerned with women's dress. He's parodying liberal conventions and liberal language. He's particularly exercised by the sexual revolution of the 1960s, which he thinks has kind of led to this moral decay. Yeah, absolutely. He's absolutely fascinated on this topic. But he writes about it in such detail that you come away with the kind of thought, why are you writing about women's breasts in so many different ways and are so keen on describing them? And, he's particularly keen on the subject of lust and male lust and temptation. And a lot of the blame in these circumstances is placed on women and how women dress. So when I pressed him on this, I said,
Do you think women should wear modest dress?
Yeah, of course. Right.
Well, what is modest dress?
Not what they're doing now. Well, I could pick on yoga pants or...
Because it tempts men.
Yes, and it betrays, because of what it does to men, it's tempting to men, and because of what it does to the lady, it makes her less of a lady.
Which ironically kind of means that his worldview almost matches onto that of the mullahs in Iran. And then he started to use language that I have to say I've never come across in an interview before.
Men know what they think of hookers, which is not very much.
And then he repeatedly used the word slut.
For a woman to dress like a slut is a different kind of degradation. So I would like...
Is that, that language some people would kind of... slut? Yeah.
They object to it because I used it.
Yeah.
Which, again, I have never sat in an interview where an interviewee just volunteers this language.
No. Well, not in any normal interview, but also certainly not in an interview with a pastor.
Right. And he frames this as a cheekiness, that he is taking the moral standards of the 21st century and the degeneracy of places like San Francisco and New York and using their language back at them.
They have slut walks, right? And I say, look, wait, come on. We're communicating here. You have this slut walk because you're proud of it. And I think you shouldn't be proud of it. And
I would struggle to call a woman a slut.
Well, there's a difference here. Here's another thing.
Just out of politeness as much as anything.
I would never, I would never and have never in my life called a woman a slut.
Right.
I wouldn't do it.
It is pretty shocking to sit in an interview and hear those words used again and again. And at one point, I did actually I was so astonished that I did actually challenge him over it and said, well, why are you using this word? And he continued to use it.
That's so bizarre. And, at a time where here, in the Church of England, you've got a woman at the head of it. I mean, did he understand that would look like an odd opinion in many parts of the world, especially in the West?
He knows it is, but he is provocative, and this gains him an audience. And nowadays, in parts of American society, this is entering mainstream discourse as a kind of pretty acceptable debating topic. When we talked about the Archbishop of Canterbury, he said it was appalling.
1 Timothy 2:12, Paul said, we're Bible Christians. We believe what the Bible says. Paul says that women are not to teach or have authority over men in the church.
And cited it as evidence of Britain's kind of slide into the moral abyss.
And where is he on immigration and race?
Well, it might not surprise you to know he doesn't favour high levels of immigration. He's pretty adamant that the US needs to significantly reduce its amount of immigration. He talked about the UK importing Islamists, as he describes it, and that kind of changing the fundamental character of the UK. I mean, these are arguments that were reflected in the US national security strategy earlier this year when it talked about civilizational erasure in Europe. But it's also America's own history and its fraught relationship with race that he kind of wades into in a pretty extreme way. He says that he isn't defending slavery at all. At the same time, he says that, white slavers in the antebellum South before the Civil War were on kind of firm scriptural ground, and that you can't apply moral questions about their souls from a contemporary perspective.
And, I mean, is this controversial in America? There must be many people who are very offended by some of these beliefs.
Yeah, of course it is. For the vast majority of Americans, it is very controversial. There are protests all the time in Moscow, Idaho itself. I mean, there are local investigative journalists, there are podcasts about the movement, delving into some of the more unsavory aspects. There was a big investigation into Christkirk in Moscow in 2021 by Vice News, and it specifically looked at one woman who moved there when she was 16, married into the church, and says that she was raped by her husband, repeatedly, and that when she consulted with the church elders to kind of ask them for their help, they basically said that there's no such thing as rape in marriage, and that women are obliged to satisfy the kind of desires of their husbands. Now, when I asked Doug Wilson about this, he said that the woman in question was well known and that she was a liar.
So this particular woman, I know who she is. This particular woman lies. She's just a liar, makes stuff up. Her ex-husband is remarried. We reject wholeheartedly the idea of rape in marriage is not okay. If we knew that a man had raped his wife, he'd be excommunicated. So she's just making stuff up.
But there have been other instances. There was a paedophile member of the church who was convicted of lewd contact with a minor under the age of 16, who then appears to have basically been welcomed back into the church after his conviction. Wilson wrote a blog post where he said that this paedophile member of the church had been held accountable by the elders within the church.
So this is a church that does seem to be mired in controversy, and not just for its views. How does it end up in the political sphere? How does Doug Wilson cross paths with the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth?
It was worth delving into Hegseth's biography a little bit. Now, he was a veteran who fought in Afghanistan and Iraq. He had a bit of a complicated background. He had been married twice before. He appears to have had some sort of drinking problem, although he denies this. He then became a presenter on Fox News and was making a documentary about education in the US. And he came across the CREC movement schools where he basically became convinced by the kind of conservative brand of education that they were instilling in children. But Hegseth was actually living in New Jersey at the time. He was working in New York. This was a few years ago. But he was so convinced by Wilson's arguments that he actually moved his family to just outside Nashville in Tennessee so that they could attend one of the churches and the children could be educated at one of the schools. And it's this relationship with Hegseth that has made Doug Wilson one of the most influential pastors in America. And more than that, a significant actor in world politics because of the way in which Hegseth views the war in Iran.
George, you've been telling us about Doug Wilson and the influence he now seems to exert over Washington. A lot of that is through his relationship with the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. How close are they?
So when I asked him on this, he was pretty guarded, but they certainly communicate. Doug Wilson says it's restricted to spiritual matters, that he doesn't kind of stray out of his lane on policy issues. But given that Wilson happily blends politics and preaching on a daily basis, and I attended one of his church services in Moscow, Idaho, where people were literally being encouraged to vote for Christian candidates, it's hard to say. But the fact that he was invited to the Pentagon just days before the beginning of the Iran war really kind of shows how much respect Hegseth has for him. And indeed, the fact that he is opening a church in Washington shows this kind of expanding influence over the right of American politics.
And Pete Hegseth himself doesn't shy away from bringing religion into politics. I mean, tell us how he sort of used it in the run-up and the execution of the Iran war.
So this has caused some discomfort in the US military, the fact that he so openly kind of uses these prayer sessions to promote his particular strand of evangelical Christianity. He frequently kind of quotes the book of Psalms. This line, break the teeth of the ungodly, comes from there. But then it's kind of augmented with these kind of slightly strange militaristic prayers, this sort of language that is a kind of weird fusion of the Old Testament and military jargon.
Grant this task force clear and righteous targets for violence, surround them as a shield, protect the innocent and blameless in their midst. Let every round find its mark against the enemies of righteousness and our great nation.
Then he also obviously got mocked for basically ripping off a prayer from Pulp Fiction and seemingly not being aware of it at the time. And you might remember that scene where Samuel L. Jackson is acting as judge, jury, and executioner, standing over this stricken man, quoting this quasi-biblical verse.
You read the Bible, Grant? Yes. Well, there's this passage I got memorized. Sort of fits this occasion. Ezekiel 25:17.
And it's kind of one of the great monologues of what is a great film. But Hegseth seemingly was unaware of that and inadvertently quoted from it, apparently in total sincerity.
The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides.
The path of the downed aviator is beset on all sides.
By the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men.
By the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men.
And you will know my name is the Lord.
And you will know my call sign is Sandy 1.
When I lay my vengeance upon thee.
When I lay my vengeance upon thee. And amen.
I asked Doug Wilson about this. He said, well, Pulp Fiction is not my kind of movie, which I thought was quite funny and kind of emblematic of his kind of more traditional cultural tastes, that he hadn't seen a kind of Quentin Tarantino classic from the 1990s.
And it's not just the speeches he's been making. I mean, his tattoos famously are, sort of already lean into a fairly fierce version of Christianity and a lot of crusader language.
Well, that's it. As well as using these prayers that kind of frame the conflict as some sort of holy war, he has actually on his kind of pectoral muscle, and there are plenty of images of Hegseth with his top off because he quite enjoys kind of working out and talking up the benefits of doing weights, etc. Anyway, when he takes his top off, you see there's a big tattoo on his pectoral muscle on his chest of the Jerusalem cross, which is obviously a kind of symbol adopted by the Crusaders. And then he also has this kind of Latin motto, Deus Vult, God wills it, which is on his bicep. And again, this is a kind of Crusader motto, but it has a kind of afterlife in that it also was adopted basically by white supremacist groups as well. So it's this combination of kind of prayers referring to the conflict in Iran as a holy war and these Crusader symbols that kind of add to this impression that this is a religious war as much as anything else in the eyes of the war secretary.
How much is that brand of Christianity, Doug Wilson's version of it, how much do you think it is influencing the policy towards Iran and influencing America's foreign policy at the moment?
I think it's hugely influential in the absence of a kind of strategic direction from the White House itself. You know, Trump famously responds to whatever he's read or heard last. So he's quite an impressionable president. The irony is that Doug Wilson himself referred in our interview to him as not a kind of godly Christian man. You know, he's skeptical that Trump himself is a true believer. And indeed, he said that the tweet that Trump recently did, comparing himself to Jesus in this kind of AI image.
What did he make of that?
Well, he said it was blasphemous.
The president shouldn't have tweeted it. I'm glad he took it down. It was blasphemous. And his defense that he thought he was a doctor and not Jesus just means that it was accidentally blasphemous if you take his word for it.
And you don't take his word for it.
I thought his excuse was lame because of the robe he was wearing. He wasn't wearing a stethoscope.
Nevertheless, the overall impression you get is that he's willing to overlook these kind of indiscretions because he thinks there are wider victories that the Christian right has notched up in recent years. For example, the overturning of Roe versus Wade and therefore the banning of abortion across a whole swathe of the US. He perhaps sees J.D. Vance, the vice president, who is more overtly Christian, as the likeliest candidate to succeed Trump, and then he can further the kind of Christian agenda in the White House. So I think he sees Trump basically as a vessel through which his kind of beliefs can be pushed.
So, George, clearly Doug Wilson has managed to grow a tiny church into a huge movement. He's exerting a lot of influence, it seems, over policy in Washington right now. What next for his church?
Well, he said his mission was simple, which is to take over the world. That's what he believes he's been instructed by Jesus to do. He needs to win every single soul for Christ. And so the mission is that he wants to take over the world. You know, this is a very strategic way of taking over American politics that might not last, months, it might not last years, it might not last decades, but eventually the aim is to turn America, the world's superpower, into a theocracy. And then from that point, you can establish evangelical Christianity across the entire rest of the world. In the UK itself, he's opening churches in London and Sheffield. He already has some in Europe, I believe in Eastern Europe mainly, but he thinks that he can gain more of an audience in the UK as well.
What does it tell us about modern America that his church and his movement, which, does espouse a form of Christianity that many people would find regressive and controversial, that it seems to be doing so well?
I think there's two things going on here, which is the reality and the presentation. The reality on the ground in Moscow, Idaho, is it's not doing well. You just need to walk down the main street and look at the shops and look at the majority of people there and say he is losing the battle. Nevertheless, we live in a world of perception where politics can be created through, hype on social media and, benefiting from the kind of how the algorithm rewards extreme content. And that gives the impression that you have significant influence. And more than that, you end up having significant influence. That is the kind of the tension at the heart of American politics, in a way, that some of these extremist fringe beliefs that when you go and kind of see it on the ground, you think, well, this is really failing. It's not making any indent. And yet you look on your computer and you scroll and this is the stuff that will be at the top of your feed.
That was George Grylls, Washington correspondent for The Times. The producer today was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Tim Walklate, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.